If you could survive in China, you could thrive globally. We should expect great things from China rather than continuing to predict their doom. Because I'm plugging the don't get BYD'd concept, complacency towards Chinese excellence is what causes us to underestimate them as either a collaborator or a competitor. Do not do that.
I actually think, when I question certain CEOs of semiconductor companies here, I've actually identified that Trump was one of the best things that could have happened to the China semiconductor ecosystem. Today's special guest is none other than Zak Dychtwald, the CEO of Young China Group and Bridgeworks, and author of Young China. If you haven't ordered the book, please order the book. It's an absolutely fantastic read. So, without further ado, let's dive into the discussion.
There's a lot of people with exciting projects elsewhere in the world, but even though China won't be surpassing the US, and I think that's the metric people are judging it by. Binary, surpassing the US, yes or no? I don't think it will. Most economists would agree. But it's still larger than the third, fourth, fifth, and sixth economies combined. When I went back to New York, it felt boring. I woke up every morning thinking, ooh, that energy I felt in China, how do I get that back? We don't appreciate the degree to which China and the US are now leagues apart from the rest of the world. China is the second largest economy in the world, and what is increasingly a global economy of two. They have lived through what is truly the greatest Cinderella story in the history of modern economics. What makes China so unique and so relevant to your group is that it's not only young people who are making trends, they're also moving markets, particularly in these industries. It's the most competitive consumer environment in the world. So in 1990, post-90s generation, when that first cohort was born, the per capita GDP in China was around $300. So imagine that, $300. You're not really consuming. BYD will have zero market share in the United States because of tariffs and bans. It already has 70% market share in Brazil and 40+ market share in markets like Australia, Malaysia, Thailand. Apple celebrated 27% user adoption, monthly active users in the United States for Apple Pay. 27% monthly active users, not daily. In China, you had 97% penetration, daily active users for WeChat Pay and Alipay. Chinese products today are the worst they'll ever be. No one's ever made a lot of money betting against China. Is it worth hustling? Will hard work lead to success? These are the sorts of questions that are in the air right now in China.
Today's guest is Zak Dychtwald, founder and CEO of Young China Group, a leading research and consulting firm specializing in the intersection of business, culture, and demographics in China.
Zak's work explores how China's youth are shaping the future of the global economy and impacting international relations. His book, Young China, offers a groundbreaking look at this powerful demographic.
We're excited to have him share his expertise. As a seasoned observer of Chinese society, Zak brings invaluable perspective to our discussion. Let's dive in.
Hello, and welcome back to the Semiconductor Leadership Podcast, where we dive into the latest and greatest of cutting-edge R&D industry trends and just general leadership initiatives and guidance from the best of the best in the industry. Today is with absolute great pleasure to welcome a very special guest, which is actually going to give you a whole different view and perspective on what you hear and see on a day-to-day basis. Today's special guest is none other than Zak Dychtwald, the CEO of Young China Group and Bridgeworks, and author of Young China. If you haven't ordered the book, please order the book. It's an absolutely fantastic read. So, without further ado, let's dive into the discussion. Zak, lovely to see you.
There's so much finally. We've been friends from afar for a while. I'm a bit of a fan, and so hopefully I'm not shaking out here about doing today's interview. But
I'm a huge fan, and from your side of things, we have something very similar. Just to go back into time, I actually started this association here in China in 2010, and you got here in 2011.
2011, that's right. We probably passed hitting a dip being somewhere. It makes sense to me that you guys started here, and to see how you've thrived globally. One of the themes I'm sure we're going to touch on today, if you could survive in China, you could thrive globally. It's great to see you with that global reach.
Thank you, Zach. I mean, one of the key things that I found quite interesting when I first came into China in 2010 was that I stood out as a sore thumb.
Yeah.
Did you get the hat accent?
When I first came to China, and so that's well, you and fire. Sorry, I'm talking. And you're totally welcome, but totally, there was novelty to being a foreigner. Now people don't really care.
That's a good.
It used to I would go to Guizhou for Chinese New Year back in 2012, 2013, and I distinctly remember people telling me, 这是我头一回见到一个活着的外国人, which means this is the first time I've seen a living foreigner, which is a terrifying area of saying that they've only ever seen foreigners on TV.
Wow.
There was much less contact with the outside world, much more novelty when foreigners came. And now a city like Shanghai is global, even though as of 2023, there were fewer foreigners living in Shanghai than there were in 1923, 100 years earlier. So we are currently at a dip in inside-outside engagement here in China.
Yeah. I mean, this is, of course, heavily impacted by the pandemic situation. But I think, still at the end of the day, no matter what the sentiment is out there, Zach, there's a very well-known saying, and I'd love to share this saying with you, and you can actually write it in your next book.
That's perfect.
Is that God made Adam and Eve, and everything else is made in China. So,
I have, I've heard a lot. I've wondered how well it is,
so
it's the truth. And we're going to talk a lot today about what makes China competitive still. We're going to talk a lot about what makes China relevant today. I would say it's the fact that we even are having this questioning shows how it's easy for our logic to get skewed. China is the second largest economy in the world, and what is increasingly a global economy of two. I know there's a lot of people with exciting projects elsewhere in the world, but even though China won't be surpassing the U.S., and I think that's the metric people are judging it by. Binary, surpassing the U.S., yes or no? I don't think it will. Most economists would agree. But it's still larger than the third, fourth, fifth, and sixth economies combined. We don't appreciate the degree to which China and the U.S. are now leagues apart from the rest of the world. In fact, at the height of the Cold War, Russia-U.S. competition, Russia at its peak only represented 10.5% of the global economy. Today, China represents around 18%. It's just not the same. So staying relevant with China, understanding the power of the consumer economy here, particularly in this industry, in your industry, whoever is out there, if you're not, you're missing the boat.
Yeah. I mean, this is a mandatory fact, Zach, is that, look, in semiconductor manufacturing, the industry or the driver of demand isn't military. It's actually consumer. Military is pretty low, high margins, but it's still very it's a great business, but very low. But in semiconductor manufacturing, the consumer market is what drives the industry. It's quite interesting. You gotta realize that at the start of the year, the major show is CES, which is a consumer electronics show.
Yeah, and it happens where? It happens in the U.S.
Yeah.
So I've been very lucky to speak at a couple of pretty large semiconductor conferences. Really, I'm a fan of the industry. I'm a supporter of the industry. And I try to be a bridge within the industry. I feel lucky to be adjacent to it. But if you look at the four major end products that come that are essential to the semiconductor world, you're talking about what? You're talking about laptops, smartphones, EVs, and I have this written down, certain video games, right?
Sure.
I mean, I think military, the data that I saw is a single-digit portion of at least the where the semiconductors end up. It might not be in terms of revenue or gross spend. But if you look at those four categories, China is the lead consumer in all of them. 100% of them. And what just to nuance this a little bit, not only is China the lead consumer in all of them, but Chinese youth, and youth here is used youth-ish, young-ish people, young adults. Youth is changing, folks. In the United States, where I'm from, where I grew up, if you're trying to understand who's going to be impacting the economy, you really look to Gen X and boomers. So in the United States, you have young people who move markets, who make trends, but they're actually not moving markets. Most of the wealth is aggregated at the top of the demographic pyramid in the US. What makes China so unique and so relevant to your group is that it's not only young people who are making trends, they're also moving markets, particularly in these industries.
Yeah. No, that's a very, very valid point, which therefore leads me to a key question that I need to ask you is that, could you share how your work with Young China Group and Bridgeworks came about? I'm intrigued to understand that, and what inspired you to kind of focus on China's young generation and where they're at and where is China moving forward to? Because the one thing that I kind of highly appreciate, especially from both of our perspectives, is that we've got many years ahead of us. Right? And I even touch wood, but I'm really intrigued to understand what's your perspectives on it. So how did it come about, and what inspired you to focus on this region?
It started with science fiction, and that sounds a little goofy, but it's true. So I grew up in Northern California near Silicon Valley. About half of my high school now sells technology products, so thank you. We're totally in that ecosystem. I went to Columbia. I studied literature, psychology, and business, which very quickly can add up to unemployed if you don't play your cards right. I was deciding where to study abroad. And I go into the Columbia Study Abroad department, and they have all these pamphlets. This was back when people still used paper. You might remember that.
Yeah.
And I looked at Europe, and the pamphlets for that looked like, honestly, a history book. Come study the history of art, language, philosophy, religion, all really interesting stuff. And then I specifically found the pamphlet for the University of Hong Kong, and it looked like the cover of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, my favorite science fiction book at the time, which of course became Blade Runner. And I had never been to Asia. I had taken a Chinese literature course, which I was totally fascinated by, and a Chinese modern economics class, which is, anyone who could do arithmetic, also pretty entranced by. And so I came. Truthfully, I came on a whim. I was in Hong Kong. On weekends with the robotics team at University of Hong Kong, I would go to Shenzhen, and that's when my interest turned a little bit more legit. I would see young people elbows deep in technology parts with a level of technological fluency that I had just never seen back home. I started to travel throughout the country and realized pretty quickly that our understanding of China back home was far apart from what I was seeing on the ground. It was far apart in two ways. First, when people think of China, they think of big government, which is scary. Right? Big government. They think of big economy, which is exciting or scary, depending on which side of that you're on. They very rarely think of the people. And when they do, they think of politicians and old China. So I felt like I was seeing something that was different. It was different than what I was reading about, and I was reading everything. It was different than what people were talking about. And while there's many interesting things to study around the world, I also am interested in impact and consequence. And the gravity of our misunderstanding, its potential impact to global economies and global businesses, was such that when I went back to New York, it felt boring. I woke up every morning thinking, ooh, that energy I felt in China, how do I get that back? So I came back, started really intensely studying the language. After about 2 years, I passed the HSK 6, which is the highest level of things that you could test for. I was living in second and third tier cities. I ended up researching for around the country. I've been to every province at this point. A book that would become Young China, How the Restless Generation Will Change Their Country and the World. It's in, I think, 7 languages now. It did pretty well. How that became a business was much to my surprise. People recognized that what people wanted in China, what young people, how they were seeing themselves, what they wanted for their family, their futures, their country, had major economic consequences. And so investors started to call me up. And I, who thought he wanted to be a journalist or an academic, then spoke to journalists and academics who very quickly dissuaded me from either profession and realized that, wow, okay, I could take resources from the private market to continue to do the exploration that I'm so fascinated by, as long as I can work towards understanding how this generation could change the world. And that was it. And then I was doing things were good. And then there was this crazy event, you might remember it, called COVID, that turned my life upside down. And it was during that time that we founded Bridgeworks. So just quickly on this, Bridgeworks is a cross-geography collaboration lab. Basically, it became really clear to us that while a lot of organizations have good strategy, and this was focused on China at the beginning, where they were typically failing was in the quality of their collaboration. When people look at collaborating across borders, they typically focus on culture, which is sort of sexy, right? But really, culture is just one of 5 pillars. And so we've started doing quantitative research as well as academic research on the best processes of collaboration, which include collaborating across distance, time zone, culture, power dynamic between headquarters and regional office, as well as process. And so what we're trying to do is build bridges at the beginning between China and the U.S. And then as clients came, it was okay, maybe China and Europe as well. But now we're taking lessons from our research and making it, okay, China, India, or maybe India, U.S., or maybe U.S., Mexico, India. My goal right now is to become first the smartest in the world on this topic. How do you collaborate well across borders? What makes organizations tick? What makes regional offices and headquarters collaboration smooth, seamless, productive, trustful? And then how can we help the most impactful organizations and people in the world? And so it's pivoted, it's grown. I thought I wanted to be a sort of China whisperer forever. And I have to say, I found a lot more meaning in creating these bridges between organizations and people. So we're aiming to really impact millions of people. I'm not a software company, so I can't have the scale that you all dream of. But I'm really excited about this new direction.
I think from your perspective, do you feel that your views on business and technology in the region or globally or whatnot, is that kind of easy to be transcended to other organizations who think that they know how to do it better?
Well, everyone thinks they know how to do it better. This is the kind of fun part. The smartest and best organizations we work with are comfortable with saying what they don't know. This is a classic Confucian saying. There's truthfully a Confucian saying for everything. So you could play both sides of the coin, but it means knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know is true knowledge. Most of us don't have true knowledge, myself included. We all have our blind spots. We've started to work with some really big names who are really clear that their collaboration is what's pulling them down. What's cool about our quantitative approach is it gives people a KPI for collaboration. One of the big issues with collaboration is it doesn't show up on your balance sheet at the end of the year. And so a lot of managers just aren't incentivized to fix it. I was stunned, by the way, when I realized that was an issue at first. Now, my background is not in large organizations. When there's a problem in a small organization, you fix it. Does it really matter if it leads to our promotion or does it really make our balance sheet look sweet for investors? And so it's what we're trying to do, and I think what we've started to do pretty successfully, is to share these best practices with leaders and help them inject it into their organizations. And we've seen a huge amount of success with it. Measured not only in dollars and cents, really important, but also quality of life. I think in the semiconductor industry specifically, so as there was a great migration away from China during COVID, and really with the friendshoring and nearshoring themes, both, not just one. What a lot of managers talked with me about when they were leaving was not the business reasons why it made sense, not like, okay, yes, regulatory risk, yes, the dollars and cents. They were mostly just like, man, am I glad to be out of China. Well, why? They're like, it's just so hard. The friction of communication, the friction of not knowing if I can trust this person or not, spanning the cultural distance. And this was back in, let's call it 2021, 2022. People were exhausted after some hard years of having to bridge that distance. What I think people are relieved by when they work with us is we give them an understanding and a language to articulate how bridging that distance is labor. It's not written into the job description. It's not appreciated when people are doing their end of year review. It's not even taught as a skill, but it's essential labor to being successful here. What's fun now, as we're talking with executives, is they're going everywhere else and they're like, ooh, China seems pretty sweet right about now. Like they were doing a good job. I didn't appreciate how seamless things were, and it's actually harder elsewhere.
That's a very, very valid point. I want to go into your book a little bit, if you don't mind. We'll go back into the structures and the themes and etc.
Whatever you want.
Yeah, no, appreciate it. Your book is, of course, discussing how China's younger generation sees themselves differently from older generations.
Yes.
So could you elaborate on a couple of insights that might impact how companies in a variety of industries, preferably in semiconductor companies, should develop products or strategies for the Chinese market?
Yeah. Well, when you're thinking about this young generation for the semiconductor industry, you're thinking about two things, right? You're thinking about market insights and workforce insights. Semiconductor is probably mostly workforce, right? But you have to be thinking about your end user in mind. What do semiconductors get put into? On the consumer electronics world, and kind of anything is a consumer electronic now, our cars are included. This is the mecca. This is your biggest consumer base in the world. It's also your toughest consumer base in the world. It's your most discerning consumer base in the world. It's the most competitive consumer environment in the world. We were joking before, and I said this at the beginning, that if you could survive in China, you could thrive elsewhere. We should come back to that. Insights. So there's a couple of elements that make this young generation different, not just from their predecessors, so young China, old China, right? But actually from their global cohort as well. And we're in the middle of doing a global piece of research with EY on what it means to be young today, with 10 different markets, India, China, U.S. all included. It's going to be really interesting. I'll share it with you when it comes out.
Okay.
Young China versus old China. The first thing that has to be discussed is the pace of change. We created something called the Live Change Index. I know you guys do a little bit of editing, so this is going to flash on the screen in a second, which was trying to contextualize the amount of change this young generation has lived through, which is hard. When I would give talks about this to investment groups around the world, they'd be like, yeah, China's changed a lot. Stockholm's changed a lot. I'm like, this is not the same. From 1990, when we're talking about Chinese generations, we don't use millennial, Gen Z. Those buckets are created by American marketers. They do not fit in China. So we typically talk about the post-90s, the post-95s, whereas in the US, there are 20-year buckets for the most part for these generations. In China, you do 3 to 5 years. That's what it takes because China changes so fast. So in 1990, post-90s generation, when that first cohort was born, the per capita GDP in China was around $300. So imagine that, $300. You're not really consuming on even a Huawei level. You're not really impacting the global consumer economy. You fast forward to today, and China's per capita GDP has increased 33 times in their lifetime. Sit on that. I'm an American born in 1990. Surprise. Haven't aged well. It's tough out here. Entrepreneurial life, is so easy. But from 1990 to today, I watched our per capita GDP in the United States. So the quality of our education, the the length of trips my family could take. However you want to imagine it in terms of quality of life. It's increased around 3x in that same period of time. So in China, 33x, in the US, 3.
Well,
Maybe it's just a developing country thing, right? What about India? And actually, in 1993, India and China had the exact same per capita GDP, around $350. India, 1990 to today, I watched their per capita GDP increase around 5x in that same period of time. In fact, if you look at the top 40 economies today and you do that same metric, lib change from 1990 to today, what you'll see is a trend, and that everywhere else in the world is under 10x.
well,
China is 33. It stands alone. It's an outlier. And so what you understand this young generation, the first thing you have to understand is what they've lived through. They were brought up into poverty. They have lived through what is truly the greatest Cinderella story in the history of modern economics. And they're also realizing, it's not all good, by the way. They're also realizing that that Cinderella story has a double-edged sword because it's not going to happen again. So first thing you need to know about this young generation is pace of change incredible. Second, we think of them as the restless generation for a reason. There's a pretty high level of anxiety about the future. There is recognition that their parents lived through the most combustive moment of growth, combustive in a good way, their economy and most global economies will likely ever see. It's not going to be the same for them. And so that transition has been deeply accelerated by the COVID years. What most people don't appreciate is that this young generation, and actually all of your managers, so when you're thinking about your workforce here in China, all of your managers, COVID and right now is the very first downturn they've ever lived through. They didn't have the financial crisis. The financial crisis was kept out through a variety of different stimulus packages. That's why China has understimulated in this case. They've only seen the graph go up and to the right. They've only watched their village turn into a town, turn into a city. They've never seen stagnation before. This is the very first time. It's an economic earthquake. And when you do during an economic earthquake is first you run for cover. Second, you wait for aftershocks. Third, you look at the rubble and decide what life is going to be now. And this young generation, as well as all of your managers, are negotiating, okay, what do I want from life now? Do I still want to live in a first-tier city, or is life actually really good in a second or third-tier city, particularly with China's logistics network? The next piece that you should consider is exposure. The older generation in China, the vast majority of them were not college educated. In 1999, there was only 1 million college students in China. This last year, China graduated 13 million, I believe. So just incredible growth. By the way, there's a major mismatch between jobs available and jobs wanted by this generation. This goes back to anxiety. There's millions of open factory jobs that this young generation does not want. This young generation will not make the world shirts, full stop. And the last piece to consider is pride. People get a little antsy about this, right? This idea that this young generation doesn't have the right to be proud of their country because we have opinions about styles of governance. We have opinions about the government here in general. But when we do that, we discredit what this young generation has lived through and seen with their own eyes. And not just here in China. 1/3 of all study abroad students in the United States come from China, 1 in 3. Why would the world's largest government, who's quite interested in the mental diet of its population, encourage their students to study abroad in China? That level of exposure is a really big part of who this young generation is. That level of exposure also makes them feel that, hey, the U.S. ain't so hot either. Like, the reality is most government systems are flawed. At least ours gets stuff done. Now, the asterisk on that, just to finish this thought right now, that organizations need to recognize is this weakness in the current Chinese economy, the fact that the job market is dead and slumping, and just the lack of good stories in the air. This is one of the cool things about 2018, 2019. You always knew someone who was raising money. You always knew someone who had made an exit. You always knew someone who got a promotion at Alibaba or Tencent or Pinduoduo. Like, there was just a lot of good stories. To the extent you had FOMO, like, it's like, damn, something should be good storying over here.
right.
Now there is not that in the air right now. For employers, it's an incredible opportunity to be an outstanding employer here. There is more eager workforce looking for great jobs, not bad jobs, great jobs than there ever was before. But there's also a certain amount of malaise in the air, this sense of what is this all for? Is it worth hustling? Will hard work lead to success? These are the sorts of questions that are in the air right now in China.
Well, I was actually kind of surprised. Actually, this morning, I think that it was released on the Financial Times that they announced that China's GDP actually grew last year by 5.4%. And I had the perception that it wasn't doing so great. So, wherever these perceptions come from, how they, the rest of the world is.
I will say this, and there's always going to be a questioning of Chinese GDP numbers. I am not some U.S. proprietary inside PT. And so I'm not going to be, but I can tell you what it feels like here in Shanghai. It doesn't feel as bad as last year. And around the country, we do a lot of visits to second and third tier cities. It feels like people have integrated this new economic reality into their worldview. Does it feel like companies are thriving? It does not. What I will say this is the slowdown here in China these last 4 or 5 years aren't good for the global economy. And not just because it's good to have a healthy, thriving China. It's because it's unleashed the competition of Chinese companies on the world at an accelerated pace. For the last decade in China, there are a number of Chinese companies who have thrived primarily through focusing on China. They have excavated the consumer demand here. I mean, this young generation here is one of the most marketed to generations in the world, full stop, and for good reason. The problem is, as people have downgraded consumption here, all of these Chinese companies who have been competing for the local market can't hit their growth numbers anymore. And so they're being forced to look elsewhere. And back to this idea, if you can survive in China, you could thrive elsewhere. They're finding a lot of success. The places where they're not being banned, not being kicked out, you're starting to see Chinese organizations really thrive around the world. And that's been accelerated by the slumping economy here. There's this article that I'm writing right now that I'm really excited about, which is called "Don't Get BYD'd."
Don't get BYD.
Don't get BYD'd. And my editor thought I'm going to change the title. Bless him. But the idea is this. It came from, I was in 2023, I walked around with specifically European automakers throughout China. And the trip with them was quiet. It was quiet, not just because of their somber, sullen faces. It was quiet because the road was only full of EV, which it was not before. And it was brands that they had never seen or really heard of. And these European automakers had seen the numbers for years, but because they weren't here or didn't have their China-based team empowered to be influencing their global strategy, their complacency meant that they went from leading the market to being fast followers at best. Ford is now talking about building to a global Chinese standard in its new energy vehicles. That happened these last 3 or 4 years. BYD will have zero market share in the United States because of tariffs and bans. It already has 70% market share in Brazil and 40 plus market share in markets like Australia, Malaysia, Thailand. It's happening. And so again, because this young generation in China is basically a greenhouse incubator for phenomenal, competitively priced, high value products that, again, if you could survive here, you could thrive elsewhere. BYD only has 30% market share here. They're doing a lot better around the world where they don't have to compete against Chinese competitors.
Yeah, it's absolutely remarkable. I think even myself, after the pandemic, during the pandemic, I didn't come once to China. And when it was over, I came back. And it was just like, something's not right. I was like, is it a holiday? No. Or even the whole kingdom down as well. I don't know what they thought. Maybe they disabled it on the sister symbols. And it was quiet all of Shanghai. I was like, what is going on here? And of course, we're using the DD. I get my DD and EV car turns up. Gorgeous EV car. I sit down in the EV car and I asked the driver, and I said, how much is this car? It was good. It looked like a Tesla. It was literally gorgeous. It said 200,000 RMB. About $25,000 or whatever than that. And I said, for this? And it was a high class car. And then I had a meeting, I remember that night, I had a meeting in Wuxi. And the CEO of Wuxi, he came from an equipment manufacturer. Came in this absolutely cool. I thought it was a Rolls Royce.
Yeah.
Then it was a Buick.
Yep.
I remember the name. I was like, what's the name of this car? It's a Buick. Stunning on the outside. Inside, it's got a massage thing, everything like that. And, and when you look at that type of car, Zach, which is cheap as chips, but it's equivalent to like a $150,000, $200,000 car in the Western world. And I'm not kidding. If there were no tariffs in place, the world will be covered in Chinese cars. The existence of GM, Volkswagen, all of these legendary car automakers will be eradicated, without a doubt.
First, you said it, not me. So any clients out there who this was not, you can't chip this to me. But you're not.
Good tariffs need to be put in place. It's the Chinese cars when they were.
He said China in many ways wrote the book on putting preventative walls for outside competitors to develop a domestic economy. I'm fine with tariffs. I don't have any major beef with that. But you're absolutely right. And so again, what does this young generation do? This young generation sharpens companies here who have to compete. The quality of those cars, the speed of iteration, where they really thrive is on user interface, right? The user interface. That could be a massage chair. That could be the Boss bands that have certain reclines or tables that even hair over bumps will make sure that your coffee is totally intact. The user interface of those cars is unbelievable, and that the price point. In Australia is such an interesting sort of testing ground. There's fewer people in Australia than there are in Shanghai. And so it's this weird place that punches way above its weight. It's sort of culturally similar to the United States and Western Europe, but its people are used to working, living, being around Asia, and they're much more receptive to that. BYD's success in Australia and the interviews that come along with that are both great and hilarious. You have these Aussies being like, it's just a great car, man. Like, I don't care what comes from. This thing is like $15,000. It's getting me to work. The seat does this bouncy thing. Like, what's not to love? It's inevitable. I was at a U.S. Semi conference in 2023, and there's the CEO of an EV company who I got to speak with. It's a darling of the United States. And I look at that same EV and the price point for what it is, and I'm seeing consistently better. And I mean this isn't like, I would love American companies to succeed here. But when I say better, this is not some panda hugging impulse. This isn't like, I'm not a Chinese nationalist. I don't want that for the world. It's not what I'm aiming for here. Just a better product. Now, the don't get BYD'd concept becomes interesting when it's not just cars. What I think is so interesting about EVs is that we could all see it and feel it. When you're in one of these cars here and it does the massage chair thing, you're like, okay, I get it. When you see this Xiaomi SU7 look a lot like a Porsche and cost under $30,000, you're like, okay, I get it. It's intuitive to the average consumer. When you look at other industries like medtech, pharma, semiconductors, that are less intuitive to the average spectator,
right?
I think that's where the real disruption comes. And so the don't get BYD'd is really referring to China complacency. If I were to encourage global companies to think about anything differently, it would be to think about China as the incubator for their global products. Because where the Chinese market is so difficult is how competitive it is. I mean, regulatory aside, right? I know, especially for semis, there's a lot of regulatory considerations, but if you take the best ideas coming from China, some of them will be global winners. Now, where global companies can outcompete Chinese companies is on trust and global management. And so if you are competitive in China, and this is true for global companies, you could outcompete Chinese companies around the world. I really do believe that is true. So when I talk with global organizations that have a presence in China, and I ask them, what's their innovation pipeline to take learnings from China abroad? And they sort of scratch their head and they're like, Mike speaks up for China every now and then. I'm like, that's not a program, and you're going to fall behind. What's interesting about cancer drugs, which are innovated and incubated in different locations, is people don't really care if they look nice. They don't need to have the sort of Cadillac feel that a Cadillac has to have in order to have its brand positioning. Yeah. The quality and cost are what's going to matter. Can it save lives? Yes or no? And for that, that's where the Chinese competition and competitive edge is really going to be across the rest of the world, not just EVs. I think EVs are a canary in the coal mine for other industries that we just don't pay as much attention to because they're less sexy than cars.
Yeah. I mean, one definitely needs to take into consideration is that for any citizen, no matter what your role is, but in favor of entrepreneurs out there, the best big brother you can wish for is the government. I mean, it's quite obvious that the government here in China really support industries to the point where they will give them so much stimulus to be able to outdo any country in the world. Now the question is clearly this is the blueprint alongside R&D, alongside innovation. But if you have like a big brother on that perspective that really wants this country to thrive, it's going to be quite challenging for any other country to match up, especially a very rich big brother.
I'm going to say yes and no here. So there's a lot of areas where the Chinese government has one foot on the gas and one foot on the brake, just to keep with the car metaphors.
Sure.
A really easy example is bringing in global investment and encouraging global companies to operate more in China, which they want desperately post-COVID, which it's an easy thing for the Shanghai government to do. They want it's like, look, we have these innovation parks in Lingang. You should come open an office. It'll be free. We'll toss some money in. There's an incredible workforce here. And then they're going to raid the office next door, which doesn't really encourage global executives to come and make constant trips. There's mixed messages. And so I do, and that's not just for global organizations, it's for Chinese organizations as well. So it's not like the government here has everything figured out. I absolutely agree that in these strategic emerging industries, semis is the most obvious, where there is a national mandate to get ahead and really leapfrog. They will spare no cost to achieve that. Now, the success or failure of that will still rely on local, innovative, gritty, hardworking people.
Absolutely.
And there's a number of countries around the world that just toss money at stuff. This isn't the only one. Unfortunately, bureaucracy and the appreciation of just having that money tossed at you without having to have any real work to show for it, it doesn't always produce the results that you want. I think we over-index how large the government role is in producing Chinese innovation. I really do. I think that the government plays an enormous role, and they should get the credit that they deserve, and really shouldn't be lambasted to the same degree. They should be lambasted for what they deserve to be lambasted for. But in this space, they really do play a critical role. What I think gets overlooked again comes back to the people.
Right.
I gave a talk at GSA, who I know you're friends with, and Jody was great. And I got to see Jensen Huang speak, which was like, I was going to wear a leather jacket today, but that plan out. By the way, I think the fact that you guys have a global celebrity in the industry is so good. And to see someone so composed and thoughtful and, he's just such a great rep. I'm sure there's people with different feelings, but I've enjoyed watching a spokesperson rise. Secondary, of course, to Sala. It's got to be space for 2 or 3. At the GSA summit, I talked about an impact equation. I actually called it an innovation equation. I was corrected. There was a gentleman, and I think I'm going to just say his name, Rick Cassidy from TSMC, great guy, we talked a lot, who corrected this equation of mine. So on the slide, this was at the board meeting to begin with, I talked about when we talk about the innovation equation in the United States and Western Europe in particular, we really focus on the innovator, the Jensen Huang type people with cool leather jackets or turtlenecks, glasses, gazing out into the future, individuals creating and paving the road that the rest of the world will track. And we think that if you have innovation, you have impact. That's not true. The part of the innovation equation that we're missing is adoption. You could have the best idea in the world. If no one uses it, you will make no impact. Sala. You could think the best thoughts you have. If you don't have your podcast, you can't scale those ideas. It's just the truth. For these products, the ability to be adopted is what makes them impactful. Where China thrives is adoption and scale. I'll give you an example, mobile payment. So in 2014, mobile payment rolled out in the U.S. and China at the exact same time. Apple Pay came out with its product. WeChat Pay came out with its product. And Jifubao, actually, so Alipay, I actually think came out before WeChat Pay, which was pretty, so the government rule, what did they play in that? They gave banking licenses to Tencent and Alibaba, which was not intuitive at the time, right? Because they were undermining SOEs in order to do that. So that's the role that the government played. They were supportive in that respect. What happened over the course of the next 7 years, so up to COVID, where we have really good data for this, like 2020, Apple celebrated 27% user adoption, monthly active users in the United States for Apple Pay. 27% monthly active users, not daily. In China, you had 97% penetration daily active users for WeChat Pay and Alipay for anyone who had a smartphone. There was, at one point, 440x the amount of mobile payment spending in China than there was in the United States, which meant there was a style of commerce. There's a way of interacting with vendors, not just to buy your new Huawei phone, but the woman outside with a trash can over a bed of coal cooking duck. She also had a laminated QR code that you could scan to get the money for it afterwards. I mean, it was just fully seeped into every corner of China, and it wasn't in the US. Why? Is it just government support? The answer is no. If you look at the speed of iteration and people's willingness to use products here, it makes it so that if you are a fast iterating company, you are creating products that people will use. Now, leapfrogging, we always like to talk about leapfrogging. China was leapfrogging. China didn't have credit card infrastructure. The problem with this argument is that India was the exact same. And India has made incredible leaps and bounds in its mobile payment infrastructure, heavily government supported, more so than in China. But if you look at adoption rates, it's still nowhere near what we have in China and what you had in that initial burst. There's something in the water here. And I don't want to like over mystify things, but if you go back to that lived change index, the pace of change here creates an ecosystem where you have to adapt in order to survive.
Right.
And that attitude of adapt translates into adopt, which sounds really nice, but the sense is it's you adapt and adopt or you get washed away. So the other side to this is if I don't keep up, I can't survive. I can't keep my head above water. I can't survive in this economy.
So, from your perspective, then, let's say most of my time I'm dealing with senior executives in the industry, in the semiconductor market, 95% of the time.
You're very blessed, by the way. Not everyone gets to say that. It's it's such a profound feeling, Zach, to be able to rub shoulders with geniuses. Cool genius. I give it to my moves who's not as cool as Semi CEO. They're not down to earth, not as level headed. And I'm not just saying this to. I spoke at the same organization's Internet CEO Summit and Semiconductor CEO Summit, and one of them had they're a very different feel. I don't want to align anyone. Yeah, very different feel. The down to earth nature of your organization, your industry, is what makes it so attractive to me. Aside from its ability, frame.
No, it's facts. It's very true. But and that's the question I wanted to ask you: is like, how can these executives better understand and communicate with Chinese partners, Chinese employees, Chinese consumers, Chinese government, given, of course, the cultural nuances that you've studied and experienced over these years?
It's a big question. I want to take it seriously.
I mean, I can help you out. We can just say just work for Bridgeworks, right?
There's a few things that we recommend from day one. First, escape the vendor mindset. Chinese partners or teams have been incentivized for the last for decades, but still the last decade, to be phenomenal at fulfillment and execution. They've been incentivized for their quarterly and annual numbers, and they've thrived in that role. The problem with that is that means that they're only focused on near-term achievement here in China. And we've seen this with some of the best and biggest names in the world. I could say that probably, truthfully. Unlocking learnings from the Chinese market means empowering and enabling the China-based team. And by the way, the China-based team, it's not like you just flip a switch and then they're sharing with you. They also have to learn to be strategists, but empowering, enabling that team to impact global strategy. And for all of you whose regulatory risk monitors just started spinning in your head, you recognize that we live in a world where not all ideas can spread globally unfettered by government. It's not the world we live in. But if you want the best ideas from China, you have to empower and enable that team to grow out of a vendor mindset into more of a partner mindset. When we started Bridgeworks, we thought that culture was going to be at the heart of it. And we focused a lot on U.S. China. As we've talked with more and more teams, companies, and more of our quantitative diagnostic, we've realized that more than place, it's actually the power dynamic of headquarters and regional offices, or headquarters and partners. And this vendor mindset keeps teams quiet here, keeps them working towards their sales goals or their production goals, but it means you're not getting the insights that your team back home needs to keep up with the market. The second point, particularly if you're interested in building a workforce here or selling product here. And I know that many of your listeners will have partners who are selling their end products, which have their products wrapped into them.
Sure.
Your ability to have market knowledge of China is directly linked with your ability to trust your Chinese team and keep and attract top Chinese talent. What do I mean by that? There's a number of China-based teams who work two jobs. They work their 9 to 6, where they rigorously address the needs of the market here. And then they work their 6 to midnight, where they explain in their second language after working a full day to some guy named Jeff why they're doing what they're doing to meet the needs of the market. I'm making it glib, but the exhaustion, we call it explanation fatigue, for China-based teams to have to constantly explain why they're doing, why the market works differently here, what they're seeing, and why the U.S. should pay attention. The exhaustion from that means that they don't try anymore. So for U.S.-based teams, what we found, and we have a quantitative approach to this, right? We've seen that as market knowledge increases, and just, by the way, market knowledge is self-reported. We're not doing quizzes, how many provinces are there in China. You should all know that, by the way.
Yeah.
We are measuring people's confidence in how well they know the market. And that confidence in knowing the market for humble leaders who know themselves directly translates to trust in the China-based team, which typically results in letting the China team do more without too much oversight. It's not to say oversight in terms of they push product without talking to the government affairs team first. Absolutely not. But it empowers the China-based team to run because you trust them knowing that what they're doing is the right thing for that market. So the market knowledge of the team back home plays a role in trusting and empowering the team based in China. The third piece is your learn from China strategy needs to be systematic. Walking with those European automakers who all have teams in China, they're all very present here. This is the biggest auto market in the world, right? Full stop. They didn't know. They didn't know. And they had managers here who totally knew that they were losing the market. We've talked with, or I'm not going to name names here, but the country leads of major auto companies who sent texts, wrote emails, and their job really was to fly to Germany and shake people by the shoulders to be like, you are losing the market now. That company realized it earlier, but it took one person to go above and beyond what they were being encouraged to do by headquarters. And so your idea pipeline, your ability to have ground feel articulated is going to be directly related to your ability to remain competitive and successful around the world. There's this idea that I really loved that I call socioeconomic proximity. Socioeconomic proximity. It's basically a fancy way of saying what people in China make for China is a bad fit for Americans, but a great fit for Mexicans or Malaysians or Nigerians. What's designed for an average user in Chongqing is a phenomenal fit for somebody in Bangkok, even if it's not a great fit for somebody in New York or San Francisco or Austin. And so executives often wait for a global product to arrive at their home but before they believe that it's going to be globally successful, there's this I believe it when I'll see it metric. But because of tariffs and bans, and because of socioeconomic proximity and product market fit, these markets where these headquarters are based are going to be the last places where successful Chinese products arrive globally. And so if you're waiting to see it, to believe it, you will be too late. We're entering a moment where Americans will not have the best products in the world in everything. In some cases, yeah. But to your point about some of these EVs, like they really are incredible. And the way that they're priced, it's a competitive product. Some Americans would, I'm sure, like to have them. But similar to Iranian caviar and Cuban cigars, which were the only other major best-in-class products that Americans can enjoy, there's going to be more and more of those that Americans will not see. And so for executives based in the US, don't just watch what your kids are using on your phone because TikTok's banned now. Just because it's banned or the car that you want is banned or that someone can't access, it doesn't mean that it's not going to be best in class and globally competitive. Don't let China complacency creep into your headquarters and build the systems to circumvent it and prevent it.
So what I would love to understand from your perspective, well, actually, I'll give you a personal perspective on my side. What are the key things relaying into the initial part that you spoke about in terms of that employee who has to speak Chinese all day and deal with Chinese, then all of a sudden in the evening they have to deal with their European or American manager? It's an example. My colleague here, Michelle, does that with me. Yeah. It's so interesting that you mentioned that because when I came into China, I stayed there for a few years, and the business was thriving. And then I went back to England for a year. And actually, at that moment, there was a key element that I didn't realize that. Because when we work in business or when we do business in Europe or America, it's straightforward. Yeah. Identifying what the problem is. Do I have a solution to it? Done. They're going to shake hands with you, deal. When I came back a few years after and identified another GM of the region in China, they actually found it a sincere struggle. And they were like, I know when I came back, I also saw the struggle for a few years and saw revenues decrease. Then I was informed about that term, guanxi. Now, I think not many people in the Western world are familiar with how important guanxi, which is actually, for those who don't know what guanxi means, is trust.
Trust.
Relationship.
Relationship-driven trust.
Relationship-driven trust. That's the term. That's the best way to describe it in 3 words. But it was so underestimated. And I realized that even that type of trust takes time, and it takes a real bond that needs to happen. So I actually feel that this form of doing business helps a lot because it's very difficult to cheat someone. Look, if you cheat someone, that's it, you're punchy. It's got your relationships gone. From your perspective, do you see that as one of the key methodologies of the success of business here in China?
First, there's plenty of people cheating people in China. But with those are not people that you want to do business with, obviously, but sniffing that out is difficult. It's hard not to think of the arm fiasco and the case of the hidden chop, right? It was such like a comic book version of cultural breakdown. And they make great products and they were great.
So it's unexpected. That was our surprise.
And it was, what I do believe is a core competency is this: cultural intelligence. Cultural intelligence. We talk about IQ, which everyone in your industry has. I don't worry about your industry. I worry about some other industries I've worked in, not yours. Second is EQ. You're a bunch of engineers. I absolutely worry about your emotional intelligence. They like it's just part of it. I say this fondly. We do a lot of work with great engineering teams. The third, cultural intelligence, is not something that we understand and put effort towards. There's a woman named Erin Meyer who wrote a great book called The Culture Map, I think 2013, 2014. And if we get to use some visuals here, here's one of that we talk with through our clients all the time that shows 7 different spectrum across which cultures can be measured. Trust is one of them. So trust is relationship-based versus task-based. Those are the 2 sides of the spectrum. On that spectrum, the US is here, task-based, and China is here, relationship-based.
Sure.
What's right next to China, by the way? Saudi. It's no surprise that China and Saudi are really comfortable doing business together. That's how they form trust in similar ways. But across these 7 different spectrum, you can map out all these different countries and cultures. What you see across all 7 is that the US and China are on opposite sides, which is very rare. If you look at any other country bearing, there's usually some area where people are kind of close together. Also, if you're wondering why Americans always open APAC offices in Australia, despite there not really being much of a relationship with Asia, their cultural scores are almost identical. It's easy, it's seamless, it's friction-free, except for time zones. For managers to recognize that a big part of their job, a big part of their labor is spanning that distance across those cultural spectrums, once they recognize that, they could address it. The problem is, because there isn't a language for it, people don't spend time on it, they ignore it, and it's this invisible force that just weighs on them. The metaphor I use is like running a marathon with a rock in your shoe. I've never run a marathon. I hear it's hard. The first 5 kilometers, you could probably do it, right? It doesn't feel great, but you can still run. You get to kilometer number 15, and by the way, American using a metric system, I should get some sort of award for that. You get to kilometer 15 and you're feeling pretty bad. You're starting to limp. Kilometer number 25, your run has moved to a walk. And it's likely that you do not finish that marathon. Low CQ and low cultural competencies won't get you in a day, but in the marathon of teamwork, and you want to be thinking about long-term projects and partnerships. That's when those trust-based relationships really pay off. In the long run, without high enough cultural intelligence and cross-geo collaboration competency, your team's just not going to make it. A breakdown will happen.
So on that perspective then, let's switch going to the young Chinese consumer mindset.
Yeah.
Of course, with everything, one of the frustrations I have when I come here is the VPN problem. So I don't think a lot of people have that. One thing like with AI applications, I'd actually tried to use ChatGPT recently and it couldn't work. Yeah. So I presume they got their own ChatGPT just like they have their own Google.
Well, first, shout out to Microsoft. A lot of Microsoft stuff works here. Yes. But with that being said, the average consumer isn't paying for Microsoft. China is a very value-driven organization. I'm not saying that an organization, population, which is a pleasant way of saying most people are cheap. They're not going to pay for enterprise level software for their home use. It's not, there's a reason why great cars cost less here. It's what the consumer demands. You look at companies like DeepSeek, who are spending millions compared to the billions and billions and billions of global organizations, and are starting to make competitive AI. Now, their LLMs are clearly trained on ChatGPT. It's clearly a ripoff is a tough word, but it's and it's like we talked about the Xiaomi SU7 looks a lot like the Porsche Taycan. I want to make sure I'm pronouncing that right. I'm sorry if I'm not. I don't live in Dubai. I don't see there's there's where China is excellent is optimization and scale, scale, and iteration. Jing Keyu, a economist at LSE, talks about how where the U.S. thrives is 0 to 1, where China thrives is 1 to 10. AI, I think, is likely going to be in that same vein. The ability to scale it for less, the ability to make it accessible for many, I think is probable. Now, the problem that we are facing is we're in an increasingly siloed information ecosystem. The splinternet, which many people have been writing about for pretty well a decade now, is only going to get deeper, the rift of that during the AI world, particularly as governments are standing on the front of the stage rather than the back of it right now. So I think China can be competitive. I think China will be competitive.
Okay.
Their compute and their access to power, right? So this came up a ton when I talk with semiconductor executives. The China invests in supply chain, not a big surprise. You see it in the EV battery technology, a lot of the relationships in African countries where some of these rare earth minerals or rare earth metals are not accessible anywhere else. Really dominating that supply chain. The ability to create cheap, accessible, abundant energy is a critical part of success in AI, and China is really well set up for that. So I again think about this idea of an economy of two. I'm a big believer in India. We're starting to do work in India with our Bridgeworks work, and I love going to India. There was a day where I was deciding, do I want to go to India or China? And seriously, during the BRICS era, there wasn't this sense that China was the clear winner, and so I even thought. My first year in China, when I was learning Chinese, which was so hard at the beginning, I kept thinking like, damn, like I could have gone to Brazil. Hey, I could be in Brazil. And I'm really, Brazil's great as well. I'm glad I made the choice that I did. It would take India about 20 years of 10% economic growth and China having flatline growth to arrive at China's economic size today. We are in U.S. China competition pretty well exclusively for another decade at least. And that's a worst case scenario for China in many ways. We should expect great things from China rather than continuing to predict their doom. Because I'm plugging the don't get BYD'd concept, complacency towards Chinese excellence is what causes us to underestimate them as either a collaborator or a competitor. Do not do that. Those guys who I walked around with in 2023, about half of them have lost their jobs because they were the ones responsible for staying competitive. They're not now. And I'm not here to threaten anyone's jobs. And many of you are in the positions where you're unfireable. Maybe, probably not. Everyone's fireable.
Everyone's fireable.
But be comfortable that what Chinese excellence could look like might be different. Be ready to copy ideas from what you believed were the former copycat, and be prepared to outcompete Chinese companies globally because it's happening. The genie is not going back into the lamp. BYD is not giving up these global markets, as well as other Chinese competitors in pretty well every sector. It is now the norm. And so expect competitive excellence. And again, I come back to this idea that, why still be in China? If you can survive and compete here, you could thrive elsewhere. I really do believe that to be true. And I'm seeing a couple of our clients who are starting to create these pipelines of information, learn from China pipelines. They're starting to incorporate some of these tactics. They can't call them what they are, which is things we learned from China, because their investor base would, do that thing, which, unfortunately in the investment community, China is a little bit radioactive right now, particularly in public markets. But the reality is for those companies who are willing to learn from China and have that influence their product cycle, it's been going well. It's been going well. Semis is hard because you can't catch up, is what I've been told, and it doesn't really matter how much money you spend. China is going to challenge that notion over these next few years. We'll see what they can do, but the gauntlet has been thrown down. The kneecapping of the Chinese high tech industry is the closest I thought we were going to war. I don't think people understood the CHIPS Act. It felt like, ooh, this could be it. Whether or not the gap between China's high-tech capabilities will be a yawning gap or a closing one, I think will be a definitive question in China's future. And my general advice that I heard first from this guy, Bill Bishop, who wrote something called cynicism. I actually have never said that word out loud. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, is that no one's ever made a lot of money betting against China. I can, of course, think of exceptions to that, cough, Luckin, cough. But people that made money on its way up again, too. I wouldn't, there's not a lot of upside to underestimating the place.
Do you see differences in how this new generation, younger generation, Gen X, Gen Z, perceives foreign versus domestic tech brands? And I say tech brands, I don't want to say semiconductor. It's connected, of course.
Well, what's cool is they, so we work with Qualcomm, not extensively, and I don't want to make it seem like extensively, but I really appreciate their Snapdragon campaign, right? The fact that you could have a consumer-facing campaign like that for something that takes relatively high tech literacy to understand why that's cool. I give them a lot of credit for that. I think you have far more tech literate, tech savvy young people here. Big part of that has to do with what was cool when you were young. I will never forget I stayed at a lot of Chinese hostels when I was younger. I actually lived at one for 7 months. It's where I learned my Chinese, really. And when 20-year-olds this is 2012, when 20-year-olds were gathering around to look at highlights on their phone at this hostel, where in the US it would be football or basketball, it was League of Legends. It was World of Warcraft. It was always gaming highlights. The proclivity towards technology, the acceptance of it being cool happened way earlier in China than it did in the US. Now you have NBA players and streamers, and it's very cool to play video games. It's been from a much earlier age here in China. So the willingness to accept and understand at a higher level of literacy than the West, I think, is worth appreciating here. Know that they want the best for the least amount of money.
Okay.
And know that it's going to be hard as hell to compete here. But if you can succeed here, you can succeed anywhere. I keep harping on it. I said,
this is going to be the title of the podcast.
Right? I don't have a motivational book coming out about this. By the way, the people I hear that the most are from investors here. So capital markets in China have been pretty dead for a while. There's government guidance funds, which are investing in a lot of semiconductor technology and other emerging industries, but those are government funds. And, that's not the money that a lot of these, well, semis are different, but not a lot of smaller organizations want. What all of the private investors are doing is they're investing in Chuhai themes. So Chinese themes going global, Chinese ideas going global. What every single investor is telling me is that we strongly believe that any idea that gets iterated, honed, improved upon in China can thrive elsewhere. We just believe that. And so Chinese investors are almost exclusively, from what we're seeing, investing in that idea. They're investing in Southeast Asia. They're investing in Mexico. They're investing in LATAM, throughout the Middle East. Chinese ideas that have been incubated here, taking them elsewhere. That's it. Every investment group that we speak with from China, in China, is talking about going global, and it's all Chinese themes going abroad. So this isn't even an original idea. I might have put some language on it so that there's balance in the sentence, but is one that I've just heard time and time again from talking to the best investors here in China.
It goes back. I want to identify, kind of understand from your perspective, is, let's say, would you say is China in a recession?
Ooh. I believe Chinese people have experienced a recession.
Okay.
Different. Why is that different? Typically, for something to be officially named a recession, you need a certain asset category to experience negative growth for 3 quarters in a row, I think is what it is. I mean, that hasn't happened. There are elements of the real estate market that have done that. There are neighborhoods in Shanghai whose real estate value has dropped 30, 40, 50%. It's a real crisis. By the way, I think it's also a healthy correction. So that's a longer conversation, truthfully, but it's a really critical element of understanding the real estate market here. So I don't think China is technically in a recession, although I know Wall Street Journal literally today just posted something about this. So maybe there's new data that puts this out. But I'm certain that this generation and the country have experienced a recession. What are the markers of a recession outside from one asset class going down consecutively over several quarters? First, it's job loss and a depressed job market. Absolutely. This young generation is definitely feeling the pain of the job market. Also, it's not just unemployment, it's underemployment. It's people who have PhDs taking jobs or like starting a food cart rather than finding and taking jobs that are equivalent to their education levels. Underemployment, I think, is a lot more pernicious. It's much more difficult to measure. Absolutely happening here in China. The second, consumer downgrading, no question. There's a wonderful company called Daiguan, run by a guy named Robert Wu. Their English name is Big One Labs. Alternative data company, really wonderful. I'm a friend of the company, whatever that means. And like across every observable metric, there's definitely consumer downgrades from the average spend per table being down 20, 30% in big cities to what people are willing to spend on travel. No question there. Depreciation and the starting point of wages. So this is one of the things from the financial crisis that doesn't get a lot of attention, but millennials who came into work after the financial crisis started at wages 30% lower than people who started the year before them. What's particularly sinister about that is they stay on that track their whole lives. So you start 30% lower, you get a 7% raise the next year, you're feeling really good. You're still significantly lower than the person who started pre-recession. And here in China, you're seeing that major wage depression for people starting out. Like I said, it's the first time in their lives where Alibaba is not growing and hiring, where Pinduoduo is not growing and hiring, where they don't feel like they know people who are getting an exciting raise or promotion, where people are more interested in keeping their jobs than growing, where businesses are more sitting on their hands and interested in keeping their market position than growing in market, except for those who are growing abroad. The experience undoubtedly is that of a recession, even if economists won't call it that.
I don't want to start.
They only do one more point on the recession. The reason why I think it's okay for us to use this language is because recessions pass.
Sure.
The last few years, people, it's so tempting to describe China as basically being terminal, right? Like that's done. China's it. And I do think in people's heads, this idea that China won't surpass the U.S., that was really the yardstick they were using, but not away from the metric system. I apologize. That was the yardstick people were using for China's success. Will they surpass the U.S., yes or no? But the reality is this country has been through a lot. They're very tough. I do think people have experienced a recession, and I also believe they'll come out of it. Grit, the ability to do difficult things for long periods of time. China, you talk about 吃苦的一代, the eat bitter generation. It's in the blood. It's in the water here. Again, it's the way I see, particularly a lot of Americans and Western Europeans sort of rejoicing in China's demise, I think is a pretty gross underestimation of the resilience and what will happen when the recession does end.
Sure. I don't want to. We are going to talk about Trump and the new administration coming in there. But given the geopolitical complexities, and this is heavily impacting semiconductor manufacturers, I want to talk about the U.S. We are going to talk about Trump, the new Trump administration.
Perfect.
Do you think that we'll see more cooperation between Chinese and other Western semiconductor firms, or from your perspective, different industries, or do we see a push towards greater independence on both sides? Because, some want to work with China, some want to work with America, but can't work with
China. I think the safe answer is what you just described, right? The safe answer is definitely, if things continue, then undoubtedly supply chains will have to separate, product development will separate, incubation centers will separate. They'll have one in China, one in the U.S., or creating them on neutral territory, whatever it is. By the way, just quickly on the workforce here, the amount of companies I know who secretly have a way larger engineering base in China, not like secretly, if you really dig through their financial, through their investor calls, you could find the information on it. Just because of the quality of the talent here that can't be replaced elsewhere, they tried to come back. It's pretty astounding. So when I think about innovation, just the quality of the technologists and engineers here is really difficult to duplicate elsewhere. I'm not saying that. I've never hired an engineer in my life. The amount of hiring managers I've spoken with based in the US who talk about like their quiet workforce here, it really shouldn't be underappreciated. Can't name names, obviously. I think Trump provides a lot more opportunities than a Harris presidency. I was going to speak for a global organization here in China, so based in the U.S. Here in China. Literally the day that Trump won, kind of a tough day. They have a big engineering team, but the reality is Trump was very loud on China. Biden was lethal. And continued and expanded upon Trump themes. I do believe the CHIPS Act was the most strategically intelligent and very brutal policy that could have come out to impact China. But it wasn't fully understood as that. And so we were pushed to what really could have been a greater escalation of conflict between our two countries. That's a Biden piece of legislation. I think it's likely that Harris would have just continued that. And so with that trajectory, things would have become separated. And on top of that, Harris leans into alliances. I think this is really the great source of strength for the United States. The alliance system looked like it was breaking under the first Trump presidency. Primarily, the first thing you do, tear up the TPP. It's not really a heartening. America first means everyone else second,
right?
Or maybe not at all. With a second Trump term, this question of will there be multilateral support and coordination in the same way that there was under Biden or would have been under a potential Harris presidency? Huge question mark. We know how intricate the semiconductor supply chain is. Can you still put pressure on ASML in the same way? Should we expect that? Or other providers around the world that America has done really effectively to keep China in second or further behind? I don't know if Trump will even care about that to the same degree. His cabinet is full of China hawks, but Trump is also, to a certain degree, a populist leader. And what's the biggest issue in the United States right now? It's not trade, the same way it was in 2016. It's not jobs, the same way that it really felt like it was back in 2016. It's inflation. That's what everyone was talking about. I was in the U.S. recently, and I ordered a Chipotle burrito to be delivered to my hotel. It was late at night. I had just flown in from China. It cost $34. It was $15 for the burrito, $20 as a 20% tip. That was, I think, on Madison, I was surcharge taxes, and then to get it there was like $15, $34 for a Chipotle burrito. And I'm like, I gotta get out of here. Like this is wild. It's inflation, right? And so, does being hard on China positively or negatively impact the issue that Trump's core constituents care most about? Negatively. It just, being tough on China on trade raises prices of the United States at a moment where jobs aren't quite as important. So I think there's a number of compromises and deals to be made. I don't love the trope of Trump being like a business guy, deal maker, just because I think that's a sort of easy thing to slide into. But I do think he cares about popularity. Margot Popovich, formerly Clock Tower, now over at BCA Research, wrote a book called Geopolitical Alpha. I pump macro stuff all the time. He talks about the median voter theory, that basically politicians do whatever their median voter, their core constituent wants. What Trump's median voter wants now is lower inflation. Does being tough on Chinese trade impact that? Absolutely. And not in the way that he would want. So I do think there are more opportunities. There's so many question marks and variables though, that anyone who's trying to create like a risk barometer is gonna go gray and lose their hair as the next few years. The biggest question is a second term Trump unhinged? Does he care about what his voters want? Is he interested in that median voter? And I don't know the answer to that today.
Yeah. I actually think, I question certain CEOs of semiconductor companies here. I've actually identified that Trump was one of the best things that could have happened to the China semiconductor ecosystem, aside from the latest technologies that they don't have access to due to the sanctions. But it's actually allowed them to get much more funding. Surprising. So it's actually 2016 when the sanctions came into play, it actually forced the Chinese government to spend more on semiconductor manufacturing and become self-sufficient. And what's kind of happened was that it spurred a whole ecosystem whereby technologies that they never imagined that they could be made because, as you mentioned, they have geniuses here. They have very, very smart engineers here. But at that time, pre-Trump, they didn't have the financial capabilities. And then all of a sudden, the government comes in, the big brother, and says, right, here's a bunch of money, go and be self-sufficient. And I actually saw this happen already previously. Before semiconductors, I was in solar manufacturing.
Yeah. Oh, well, gosh.
So I saw what they're capable of doing with regards to, the leaders of the world were in Germany in certain manufacturing. And it shifted all the way to China.
Germany and California, where I felt like everybody has either they're in solar or they were selling your tech products like it totally true.
And LED, they did the same, and the same thing happened in the LED market. The flat panel display market as well. So the only challenge is that with semiconductors, it's much more difficult with the innovation element, but it requires a lot of money, and it's a long-term investment. So I think that's where the Trump administration kind of accelerated semiconductor innovation in this region.
No doubt. I mean, and this is very risky of me to do. There's a variety of different ways to say this in Chinese, but my favorite is 班门弄斧. It means an amateur woodworker showing off in front of a master craftsman. I should not really talk about the semiconductor industry at all. Compared with every listener here, I am an absolute amateur woodworker at best. But what I've been told by some of the smartest people in the industry, who I have been lucky enough to meet, or people who have been in it for years, who are titans of industry, and I have been less lucky than you, but extraordinarily lucky by most standards, is they've told me that it's you can't leapfrog. It's very difficult to catch up. Once you're behind, you stay behind.
Sure.
What's so interesting about what's happening in China is it's going to challenge all of that. What role is AI going to play in breaking that down? DeepSeek is really interesting because it's already undermined how much money we thought was necessary to build a successful AI company and generative AI platform. And that's in that space. With semis, I truly do not know the answer if the relationship between level of investment and pace of change and innovation can be impacted. What I've been told is that it can. You could throw as much money as you want, and it'll keep you elsewhere.
But on the advanced technology, advanced but on the legacy, without a doubt. Yeah, on the legacy node. On the legacy node. I mean, you look at the EV cars. Yeah, they're still buying European semiconductor chips or American substrates, right? But from what I know now, is that they're getting very close to do something just as good, just as effective, and cheaper. So, I mean, let's. I think the best way to look at this is in a dimension of three matters. So, why has there been so much pressure on Huawei? If we look at Huawei previous, there's been so much pressure from the US, right? The reason why is because Huawei was better, was faster, and was cheaper. And you can do all these three, and you outdo any competition out there in the else. And that is what's going to basically happen, which leads into the next question would be, from your perspective, because, we see the China Plus One initiative happening very, very effectively over these last years, is how much of supply chain do you think will be back in China in the next 5 years?
I love that we're even asking that, because there was an assumption 2 years ago that it's gone forever. I think parts of it are gone forever, just to be clear. I think the lower value stuff, I think the areas that don't require the level of technological mastery. We were talking before, China hasn't been the cheap option for almost a decade now, depending on which product you're talking about. I spent a lot of time in Mexico during COVID, and, China and Mexico used to compete in a number of areas in the manufacturing supply chain. And I remember it was, late 2021, where we started to see former Chinese competitors of Mexican manufacturers start to invest in those same manufacturers in order to sell into the United States. Thank you, NAFTA. And we realized that, wow, China, you have to make a dollar somehow. It's great to have Americans as clients. We were joking about this before, that Americans pay more and expect less. It's not bad. But what a lot of people I've been speaking to are talking about is they miss their China teams, the ones who have left. And then the ones that are still here are fighting tooth and nail to keep what they have. And it's not even because of access to the market. It's consistently because of the quality of the talent. I spoke at the Wall Street Journal CEO Council, and Elon Musk beamed in for that. He was supposed to come. He didn't. Cool dude. And I did get to ask him a question specifically about supply chain. You talk about a guy who has complex supply chain, particularly with EVs and his relationship with the Chinese government. He's so high profile that he makes things complicated. I asked him about how he thinks about diversifying his supply chain, particularly when it comes to EV battery materials. And he thought about it for about 10 seconds, which was terrifying.
You go check GPT and he's right.
Yes, I'd seen him snipe down some journalists, and the journalist who's a friend of Thorald Barker, who was interviewing, kind of looked at me like, "What are you doing, dude? Don't play with fire." And what he said, well, first his answer was, I read Twitter because there's a lot of great experts on Twitter. I don't even think he fully get it. I think it was around the same time. Though I don't think he did say X. This was late 2023, and I don't remember exactly the timing on that. But what he said next was, people grossly underestimate the amount of hard work that China has done to accomplish what they've done in the last 20 or 30 years. It's not a simple equation of, and this is me talking now, you find a place with a big workforce who's willing to do a lot of work for cheap. Because if it were that simple, India and China would have taken off at the exact same time. It's not as simple as finding a supportive government. There's a number of governments that are wealthy and supportive that still can't actualize what China has. It's a combination of a number of these factors, but it's also a hardworking, intelligent, well-educated, practiced workforce. They've been doing this for a long time. And so delivering on time, being trustworthy. I know we focus on those couple of stories that decimate trust, but for it's the age-old journalist question. Why do you write about the one bridge that falls instead of the 9,999 that don't? Real question. Most bridges in China have been intact. Most of these relationships have been built on task-based trust. They've been very successful. And so I do think there are going to be aspects of the supply chain that comes back. The biggest question is regulatory risk. If it was just talent, if it was just this question of nearshoring, rather than friendshoring. Nearshoring is about distance. It's about supply chains, it's about logistics. Friendshoring is about regulatory risk. If it was just the nearshoring question, I think more would come back to China and it would come back faster. I think the unpredictability of a Trump presidency means that if you don't want to get burned. And so if you make a major investment in China and then Trump decides to be more erratic, then that investment can go to zero versus your investment in another company could be running at 80% efficiency. 80% is better than zero. So I do think that's a calculation. For those organizations who can find aspects of their value chain to run here, I think they will. I think people will work harder to make it work better this time around. You kind of get a clean slate, or at least the opportunity to refresh and upgrade, called Bridgeworks, by the way. Hey, CEO of a company, you gotta be putting your stuff forward. But I do think it's this moment of reflection, which is what does China do best? What can we safely do there, safely from a regulatory risk point of view? And then how can we do it better than the last decade?
Yeah, I think one of the definition you put in here, I mean, we've got market entry, we've got customer engagement, we've got talent, and we've got innovation. Now, the question that will be quite difficult for you to be able to answer, but I'm sure you've got something in your mind. Where do you see the future of China over the next 5 to 10 years? Actually, let's use the number 10. Over the next 10 years, what market forces do you believe will shape China's role in global tech in specific?
I think the number one market force is people. And people might roll their eyes when I say that, truthfully. The obvious answer is government. Like, truthfully, the thing that will impact China the most will be somebody signing a bill and forcing an entire industry left and right just on that. But if we're talking about slower moving natural forces, I think what makes China so unique is really its people, that adoption X factor, the willingness to adopt, innovate, and iterate at scale. I think when you think about the tech ecosystem here, it's the adoption, innovation, and then iteration at scale that makes it so unique here. And so, BYD sold, I think, 15,000 cars in Mexico. They want to do 50,000 this next year and 100,000 after that. I think that's real. I think when you think about Chinese technology around the world, I think the genie is out of the bottle and global competition is the new norm. TikTok might be banned, but it's still the most popular app in the world everywhere but the United States and India.
I'm sure people are using VPNs in that region.
I guess actually the interesting, have Americans start to use VPNs to use TikTok and buy, and there's like a great comedy piece that I need to read because the world is upside down. So the people side of it, I really do think is underappreciated market force. And it's underappreciated because for most people, it seems unruly versus there's this really tempting thing that executives do, which is they like the idea that there's a couple of people who, if you know what they're thinking, you'll know where the world is going. This is the sort of great man. It's typically men, sadly. This is like the great man approach to history. Like if you just know what Xi Jinping dreams about at night or what Trump fantasizes about when he wakes up in the morning, then you'll know the future. I think we heavily over-index on that. And instead, we should focus on their constraints. What can't they do? Within what world of constraint are they operating? Trump has constraints. Xi Jinping has constraints. Those constraints, those political constraints, are less sexy, but far more knowable. The same goes with people. It's you can see consistently that the market here and the people driving it incubate world-changing products. I think that will increasingly become the norm around the world. Government, I don't know what China will be in 10 years. And this, when you're a CEO, well, actually, most CEOs aren't CEOs for more than 10 years. Depending on which company, if you're a founder-led company, it's different. But I think this is the biggest variable, and why it's hard for boards to get behind long-term investment is what will China be in 10 years? I think the biggest political question, and this is a provocative one, is what does it look like after China's current leadership? What will the next leader do? When will that happen? And what will the next leader do? that there's been so much precedent that's been overturned during this current leadership that the unknowing nature of who can come next and what they'll have the freedom to do leads a lot of question marks for a decade for now from China.
Let's replace the word people with robots. What's your thoughts on that in this region?
So we've talked a little bit about strategic emerging industries, right? China invests in areas that can do, three birds, one stone, right? First, you have, can it solve a domestic political problem? EVs are a really good example of that. Air quality in major cities was one of the biggest pain points of the average citizen in China in 2013. It was a real driver of trying to clean up the cities. Second, is it an area where China can lead globally economically? And third, is it an area where China can lead globally politically? EVs are a really good example of a 3-for-1 there, right? And so it's worth investment from the Chinese government. You could argue the exact same for medical technology and pharma innovation. China has the biggest aging population in the world. Who will take care of the old? It's that same three, right? So it solves a local political issue, a global economic issue, and a global leadership opportunity. The absolute same thing goes for automation. China's economy during the 90s was built on its demographic dividend. There was a huge amount of people doing a lot of work for cheap. We like to talk about the demographic demise of China coming up, and birth rates are plummeting. People like to joke that urbanization is the best form of birth control. It absolutely is, but faster than that, China's birth rates are declining. What's the solve for that? A smaller workforce, lower productivity. You educate your workforce so they can create more value for less. Absolutely, China's doing that, but their job market can't keep up with creating enough highly educated jobs for that educated group. The second answer is automation. There's so much noise, the same thought leaders will get on their phone and talk about China's demography is collapsing and the economy will too. And then the next video will be like, China is innovating faster in automation and robot technology for manufacturing, but they don't see the link between the two. China is trying to detach its demography from its destiny. And so you look back to those three. Does it solve a domestic social and political issue? Absolutely. Declining workforce. Is it an opportunity for global economic leadership? Absolutely. This is an area where China can lead, not be a fast follower. And third, does it give China global political clout? More of a question mark here because there's the fear of robots taking our jobs. I have this relationship with Gen AI every morning. Like, is this guy after my job or what am I doing here? But that is, I will say, a bit of a question mark, but I do think automation and robots and robotic manufacturing is inevitable. And I'm certain that China will aim to lead it, not just because of the economic upside, but because it solves a social and domestic political issue.
So I want to kind of wrap up this marvelous podcast interview. I mean, it's really so many golden nuggets have been thrown in here. So thank you, Zak. I went in there with like one big surprise element where if you had to identify a single factor that might catch non-Chinese businesses off guard about the Chinese tech scene or consumer market, what would it be?
The idea that I think about a lot these days, the thing that I don't know that it keeps me up at night, but it gets me up in the morning, is this question of China global competition. And I think what most headquarters based abroad, and I say this as an American, my greatest exposures are America. I also work with German and UK based companies, but I've traveled and get to speak at a lot of places around the world. So I do interact with people from all over. I think when people think of competition, they think of competition in China and they think of competition in their home. In the case of the US, particular, just because it's the world's largest consumer market, people have the most to spend. I'm much less interested in competition in the U.S. between U.S. and China. The U.S. will win. U.S. companies will win. I am much less interested in competition in China with global companies. For the most part, Chinese companies will win, at least in the long run. It's not to say that there isn't room to compete and profit, but there's going to be strong competition here, and you should expect Chinese companies can iterate faster. What is much more interesting to me is how that competition unfolds everywhere else. And so the surprise for global executives is the surprise of a new norm that during COVID got kind of encapsulated and bottled up as a part of different trends and supply chain renegotiation, or it gets siloed in places where executives don't go. TikTok, right? Like if 4 of the top 10 apps in the United States are from China. They're banning TikTok. Are they going to ban others? Are they going to ban the other 3? Are they going to ban the 20 that are in the top 50? This is not a today problem. This is a next decade problem. Chinese products are getting better. Chinese products today are the worst they'll ever be. And they're already.
It continues to get better.
This isn't we solved it with the TikTok ban. This isn't we solved it by keeping BYD out. The competition outside of your home markets around the world in unaligned countries and countries that just want good products at the right price is only going to get more competitive for the next decade. And so if you're thinking about, okay, does Germany need tariffs so that we can protect our home market? You'll get the tariffs. The tariffs will happen, fine. You've won that margin. Congrats. The much more interesting competition to me is how it'll unfold everywhere else. So I spoke my way to the surprise, so in management, in Bridgeworks, there's this hilarious quote that I brought that a Chinese CEO talked to me about, which is, he did this very thoughtfully. He said, and he spent a lot of years in America. He was like, here in China, we organize our thoughts in order to speak. In the United States, I find that you speak in order to organize your thoughts. It's like, right in the heart. That one got me pretty good. But I do think what I said is true. I think the surprise is that Chinese products today are the worst they'll ever be. This question of whether China's semiconductor technology can keep up on the leading edge, and whether or not that gap will increase between China and the world, I think is valid. But particularly for all the other technologies that don't require the best of the best, that can have a lagging generation still power their stuff, this is the worst Chinese products will ever be. And so prepare for competition for the next decade to 5.
So the last thing I have for you is that it absolutely makes sense to ask you this, and for everyone watching all over the globe, where can people find your book, Young China? Is it on the Girl Amazon? And how can people, of course, follow your work at Young China Group and Bridgeworks?
We are, the easiest answer for that is you can find my book online. It's in wherever people sell books. There's ebook versions in most countries, and in many different languages. So, thank you for your support. And I have a mailing list that I have not written to in 13 months. That has 20,000 people. I apologize to all those people. But this year I have made a sharing goal. So as we've been thinking about our goals for the year, and we've moved from a revenue goal to a methodology goal and research goal, which I'm really excited about. We're really going all in on Bridgeworks. So I have a mailing list that I will start writing to monthly. I do write on LinkedIn regularly, irregularly, but again, this is the year where I become consistent. And so those 2 places, particularly LinkedIn, you can feel free to reach out to me. I think that's how we first connected.
Yeah.
And I know it's sort of easy to dunk on LinkedIn, but I will say I've met a lot of really wonderful people and had really high quality interactions there. So I'll share consistently there, and I'll share consistently on my mailing list. I'm also at Zak@youngchinagroup.com. Probably don't put that in the show notes. I don't get spam. But I'm easy to find. And if you want to talk about collaborating across borders, this is our year of research. And so any executive with experiences, you could set up a call with me to talk about that. You could slide in with whatever you actually want to talk about in that conversation, and I will pick up the phone and we can get on a video call.
Marvelous. Zak, we have a tradition on this show where the last person leaves a question for the next person. Yeah, so the question that's been left for you from the last interviewee is, what legacy do you want to leave on Earth or space?
I'm a gosh. I want to be remembered as a bridge builder. I felt a lot about these last few years. Truthfully, I love my Young China Group work, and I love it's like the foundation for how I see the world. But it doesn't make the level of impact that I want. And so what's exciting to me so much about Bridgeworks is I get to see impacting people. I'm deeply interested in culture and cognition. How where you're from drives the way you think, and building bridges between places that are disparate culturally, linguistically, physically. And so if I am remembered years from now as a bridge builder, then I will be happy. And the cool part about bridges is they live longer than people. Good ones, not that one that falls, but the 9,999 that don't. And so if I could have made an impact there, then that would be something that I would be proud of. And I think the people who work with me would be proud of. It's really gratifying to see we're actually impacting people's lives in a way that I wasn't able to do before when I was just talking to investors and advising people on how to be a little bit smarter on designing a product. So it's quite gratifying there. In space, I don't have I read a lot of science fiction, and I think we have no legacy in space. I think we are a dust mote flying through the vortex of the world, and the arrogance that we can leave a legacy in space, even our most ambitious space explorers. I don't think it's arrogance that they even indulge in. I think we all recognize the impact that we're able to make. So I'm going to focus on the people that I can impact and the bridges that I can make here on this earth. I will go to space though. So it's my nation cooking. I got to fill out like a bus to space whenever that comes. I'm there. I'm definitely going. I really do love science fiction. But I'm not going to pretend like, I'm really going to change the face of Venus or anything.
Perfect. Zak, what a incredible meetup for the first time. Can't wait to have you on this podcast for the future as well. And really, it's been absolutely enlightening, everything that you shared. So sincerely appreciate the knowledge that you have. And really, you've got a big fan on this side of the chair. So I am rooting for your success globally and wish you all the best.
Thank you. Yeah. I feel the same. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and keep doing the great work. I'm a big fan of this industry. I'm a big fan of what you're doing for it. It needs a voice. It needs a spokesperson. It needs many spokespeople. And so this is the mutual fan table, and it's excited to be at.
Amen. Thank you, Zak. It's a pleasure.